In this part of the chapter, we're going to cover the anatomy of the brain. And the brain, as you know, is extremely complex. There's a lot that we know about brain, and there's a lot that we still are learning about the brain. And the human brain weighs about 3 pounds. And the studies have shown that there's no relation between the size of the brain and intelligence. And although we know a lot about the anatomy of the brain now, in the beginning Aristotle thought brain was just cool blood, and currently brain actually has a texture of cooked oatmeal, so it's really mushy. So now we know that the brain is responsible for controlling of a lot of higher functions, especially in the cerebrum of the brain, right? So the spinal cord begins where the brain ends, and the spinal cord begins or exits the brain at the foramen magnum, if you remember from the bone markings of the body. So the base of the skull, where you have a big hole known as foramen magnum, that's where spinal cord exits the brain. Now, from the previous chapter on spinal cord, if you remember, the spinal cord has ascending and descending tracts. The tracts that carry information to the brain are called ascending tracts, and the tracts that carry information to muscle, glands, and organs of the body are known as descending tracts because they descend down from the brain. Now, the brain, interestingly, has a lot of blood supply because at any given time, the brain uses 20% of the oxygen in the body. But the brain does not have pain receptors, so you don't really feel pain in the brain, and that's why you see surgeries can be performed with the person wide awake in the brain, right? So the brain actually does get smaller as we age, but our cognitive skills are known to decline in the late 20s. Okay, so the brain grows till about 25, and then cognitive abilities start declining after a little bit after the brain stops growing. So at one point in time, we literally had a pea-sized brain. So this over here is the embryo at 4 weeks. Now, the neural tube, which is a structure that later gives rise to brain and a lot of different structures and all the nerves of the body, develops at about 26 days of gestation. So by 26 days, we have the neural tube, we have the central canal that later fills with cerebrospinal fluid, and by the 4th week, the neural tube develops 3 distinct sections that exhibit the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, and that's what we're going to look at. So at 4th week, now all of these is color coded. So at 4th week, the neural tube has a forebrain, which is called the proencephalon. Pro means forward, and encephalon means brain. Okay, so this means pro means forward, and encephalon means brain. So this is the forebrain. And the midsection in red is called the mesencephalon. Meso means middle. Okay. So the 3rd section is called the rhombencephalon. Rhombo means rhomboid shape. So this section, or the hindbrain, is named after the rhomboid shape it exhibits. Now, this is at 4th week of gestation. The forebrain eventually will be responsible for functions like emotion, and what else? Language, movement, learning, so sleep, memory, all the higher order functions of the brain are coordinated, will be responsible, the forebrain will be responsible for all the higher order functions. And the midbrain, known as mesencephalon, will be responsible for functions like vision, pain relief, movement. So people with Parkinson's, their motor functions will be affected because the midbrain is one of the structures that is largely affected in people with Parkinson's. And then you have rhombencephalon, also known as the hindbrain. Now the hindbrain or rhombencephalon will become the part of the brain that will be responsible for controlling blood pressure, breathing, heart rate, sleep, and balance. So the hindbrain basically becomes the rhombencephalon becomes the brainstem. Okay, so any damage to this region can cause immediate death. So at 4 weeks, we have 3 structures. But at about 5 weeks, these 3 structures further differentiate into the following. Okay, let's see what happened at 5 weeks. Now at 5 weeks, the proencephalon divides into telencephalon and diencephalon. The telencephalon ends up forming the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum. The diencephalon will end up containing structures like the thalamus and hypothalamus. These are very important structures in the brain. They are important for relaying sensory information to the cerebrum, controlling autonomic functions, motor functions, etc. We'll look at these structures in a lot more detail. But just understand where the thalamus and hypothalamus come from. And then there's another structure that is important during the 5th week of gestation, the optic vesicle. The optic vesicle develops from the diencephalon, and the optic vesicle later become the retina of the eye. Now the hindbrain divides into, let me clear this, the hindbrain divides into metencephalon and myelencephalon. The metencephalon is the part of the hindbrain that will differentiate into the pons and the cerebellum. Now, don't worry about the functions just yet, but remember, metencephalon divides into the pons and cerebellum, and the myelencephalon will form the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. Now, the medulla oblongata is a very important structure. So for now, just remember that at 26th week, the neural tube forms and the central canal starts forming, and the neural tube divides into the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain forms the telencephalon and diencephalon. The telencephalon forms the cerebrum, and the diencephalon forms structures like thalamus and hypothalamus. The optic vesicle will form the retina of the eye. Now, the mesencephalon just grows into the midbrain, does not divide much or differentiate much, and the metencephalon of the hindbrain forms the pons and the cerebellum, where the myelencephalon of the hindbrain forms the medulla oblongata. Okay, so do you remember your directional terms? We looked at rostral, caudal, anterior, superior, etc. A lot of terminology. So now's the time to put them to use. Now, the rostral end is this part. Okay, rostral end means the anterior aspect of the head, which is towards the nose in humans, and beak of the birds if you're talking about a bird. All right, so the rostral end is towards the forehead or nose, and the caudal end is towards the back of the head. Okay, so the hindbrain is caudal to the midbrain, meaning the hindbrain is towards the back, the midbrain is going to be right over here. So the hindbrain is caudal to the midbrain. So this is the superior, well, lateral view of the brain, and you have the temporal lobe laterally. You have the brainstem located caudal to the cerebrum. So these structures over here, let me pick the laser pointer. Oh, where is the pointer? Okay. So see all these folded squiggly lines. This is the outermost part of the brain, and this is called the cerebral cortex, and this whole structure is the largest part of the brain. We call it the cerebrum. The cerebrum is responsible for a lot of higher order functions in the body, and this structure that looks like a cauliflower is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located caudal to the cerebrum. And then you have the spinal cord. The spinal cord is located caudal to the brain because it's located towards the back of the brain. Okay, and the brain in general weighs about 3.5 lbs in men and slightly lesser in women. And the weight of the brain or the size of the brain has nothing to do with intelligence. So we have about 100 billion neurons in an adult brain, and the brain can be divided into three major parts. The cerebrum that you're looking at, and this region over here is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Don't worry about writing that just yet. We'll look at it again. And this portion over here that you're seeing a bit of it, that is the brain stem. Okay, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it is responsible for coordinating a whole bunch of sensory and motor functions and higher order mental functions like memory and logical reasoning. And the central nervous system also contains gray and white matter like the spinal cord. However, the cerebrum has the outer cortex known as the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the outer layer of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is a layer of gray matter. Okay, it's called the gray matter because it does not contain myelin, which makes it look dull in appearance. Okay, so this is the cerebral cortex, and it contains gray matter. Now, the cerebrum makes up 83% of the brain's total mass, and the cerebrum can be divided into the left and right hemisphere. Okay, so the left and right hemisphere are divided by a region known as the longitudinal fissure. So this over here is the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure. Okay, the surface of the cerebrum is covered with these squiggly structures, really squiggly structures like worms, right? They are called gyri. Okay, and these depressions in between these squiggly lines, all these depressions in here or grooves, they are called sulci, okay, or sulcus. Okay, so these depressions are called sulci. So if you cut the brain, if you make a mid-sagittal section of the brain along the longitudinal fissure, it will divide the brain into the left and right portions. And now we can see some of the internal structures of the brain. Now, before we delve deeper into the internal structures, let's look at the three major portions of the brain. The first largest portion right over here that we looked at is the cerebrum. So they look very different from the top, right? If you look deeper, they have these additional structures that help in functioning of the brain. Okay, so let's start from the beginning right over here. So the brainstem is the portion of the brain that connects the superior aspects of the brain to the spinal cord. Now, although the brainstem is located caudal to other structures of the brain, it is really very important in regulating functions like heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, swallowing, digestion. So if this portion of the brain gets injured, it can, send a person into coma. And the brainstem is responsible for controlling most of the autonomic functions. And that's why it makes sense that it's so close to the spinal cord. Because just like the reflexes, like touching a hot stove or being punched in the face, we don't really, when we dodge when being punched in the face, we don't really have to consciously think about chewing food or breathing. It happens anyway, right? Whether we think of it or not. Okay, so that's why it makes sense that the brainstem is located closer to the spinal cord. Okay, and next structure is the cerebellum. Cerebellum. The cerebellum contains 50% of the brain's neurons, and it is the second largest of a region of the brain, which is located caudal to the cerebrum. Okay, now you can see that the cerebellum is located posteriorly. Now, the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating a lot of motor movements in the body. Coordinating, okay? The cerebellum does not initiate the motor movement, it just coordinates movements. We'll look at that again in a lot more detail. Now, the largest structure in the brain is called the cerebrum. Cerebrum, okay? B-R-U-M. So, cerebrum is the largest structure of the brain. It's composed of the left and right hemispheres. And it performs a lot of higher order functions like interpreting touch, vision, hearing, speech, reasoning, learning, fine control of movement, etc. So finally, all the information goes to the cerebrum for processing. Okay, so this is a detailed picture for, how you can divide different structures, different parts of the cerebrum, because each portion of the cerebrum is responsible for a different function. For example, well, let's just see. The primary motor cortex is present right over here. The primary motor cortex is actually present in the frontal lobe. So this area is the frontal lobe, and this area is the parietal lobe. Okay, now the parietal lobe and frontal lobe are divided by a really deep groove known as central sulcus. Okay, so the central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Now, Each of these lobes have different functions in different regions because the prefrontal lobe is associated with voluntary movement, thoughts, and personality. So if the frontal cortex gets injured, the personality of the person changes. Okay, and that's why you see, well, it's just keep in mind, it's not just one function of the brain that affects the personality. There's so many different parts of the brain that coordinate with each other that causes a change in personality. So it's a lot more complicated than this picture. Okay, so this area is the pre-motor cortex. It controls voluntary movement. And this over here is the primary motor cortex, also controls voluntary movement. And then you have the auditory cortex, which is responsible for hearing. And this area, which is the parietal lobe, is mostly responsible for sensory integration. And the occipital lobe is responsible for visual association, etc. So this is just an overview of different regions of the cerebrum that are responsible for so many different functions. Okay, so this picture will give you a better understanding of what we're looking at. So this is the back, which is the occipital lobe. And this area is the parietal lobe. And this is the frontal lobe because it's towards the frontal bone. Okay, so that's not hard to remember. The occipital lobe is present right by the occipital bone. The parietal lobe is present near the parietal bone. The frontal lobe is present right by the frontal bone. Okay. Now, this deep groove that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe is called the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is a lot more prominent than the other sulci that you see in the brain. Okay, so in an actual brain, this groove will be pretty prominent. Okay, and this in the center is a deep fissure known as longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure divides the cerebral hemispheres into the left and the right portions. These thick folds, the squiggly folds, are called gyri. Now this is the lateral view of the brain. This is the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum. So all of this is the cerebrum. And all these squiggly folds, just like, it looks pretty much like the, squiggly fold of the small intestine. These are gyri. Okay, so these folds itself are called gyri. And these grooves are called sulci or sulcus. So the word sulci is the plural form, and if you say sulcus, is the singular form. Okay, so this is the brain, and what do you think this is? Why did I put this picture over here? Okay, when you look at this, you probably are thinking that looks like a chicken, but that's not. That's actually a brain. Okay, so right over here, you see the picture of the normal brain. And over here, you see a condition known as lissencephaly. Lissencephaly literally means smooth brain. This is a rare brain formation disorder, which is caused by defect in neuronal migration during the 12th to 24th week of gestation. And when this happens, it leads to lack of development in the brain folds we call gyri and the grooves we call sulci. This is a form of cephalic disorder. Cephalic means towards the brain, right? So this is a form of cephalic disorder. So can a baby survive with this condition? Yes, but the life expectancy of a person with lissencephaly is only up to 10 years of age, because most often the child dies due to aspiration, due to improper due to the inability to swallow food or aspiration of food, or due to respiratory arrest. Okay, so This is a condition with which a person cannot survive very long, and that's why these grooves and folds in the brain are very, very important. So the cerebrum can be divided into so many different regions based on the function, but there are four major lobes that make up the cerebrum. The one on the front is called the frontal lobe because it's right by the frontal bone. And this in between is called the parietal lobe because it's right by the parietal bone. All the way to the back, located posteriorly, is the occipital lobe, right by the occipital bone. This region over here, right by the temple on the side, is called the temporal lobe because it is located right by the temporal bone. Now, all the sensory and motor information is coordinated and controlled by the cerebral cortex, okay, and for the most part, okay. And just keep in mind, each part of the brain is not a standalone structure. All these structures talk to each other and coordinate a lot of different things in the body. Now let's look at the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing noises because it contains auditory receptor. It is responsible for understanding language, and it's also responsible for olfaction. Olfaction means the sense of smell. When you smell buttery popcorn, the olfactory receptors send the signal to the temporal lobe, and that's why we can smell the butter. Okay, and when you hear a noise, the auditory receptors send the signals to the temporal lobe as well. Okay, that's why we can hear a noise. And then you see the occipital lobe right to the back is responsible for vision. So when somebody waves the flag, the receptors from the eye send the information to the occipital lobe, which allows us to visualize the flag. Okay. And the parietal lobe is in between the frontal and the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is responsible for gustatory sensation, meaning the sense of taste. So when you taste the popcorn, the buttery popcorn, the receptors send the information to the parietal lobe, and that's why we can taste the popcorn. So you're watching a movie and you finished your bucket of popcorn and you decided to go buy more popcorn. So this message will be, sent to the primary motor area, okay, in the frontal lobe. And the primary motor area is going to send a message to your skeletal muscles to get up and go to the stall to buy more popcorn. Okay, so I don't want you to go into too much detail on the different regions, but just know the basic functions that you see in this picture for each lobe of the brain. Now, another structure that you see right over here is the insula. The insula is a hidden region, and it's located deep to the cerebral cortex. Okay, it's right behind the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, right over here. The insula helps us in understanding spoken language. It also helps in integrating the senses for taste and for visceral receptors. Information from visceral receptors. Viscera means deep. So all the information from the visceral organs are integrated right over here in the insula. So you're looking at the brain, and this brain has been cut into the front half that you don't see, but you see the back half. So this becomes the frontal section of the brain. Just like our spinal cord, we have the gray matter and white matter in the brain. The composition of the gray matter and white matter is the same as in the spinal cord. Okay, now the brain doesn't look this solid as you see. The brain is actually really mushy and it has a consistency of cooked oatmeal. The difference between the gray matter and white matter of spinal cord is that the gray region, which contains the unmyelinated parts of the neuron, is located superficially in the brain. Whereas in the spinal cord, if you remember, the gray matter is located deep in the spinal cord. Okay, so like I said, the composition of gray matter and white matter is the same. So the gray matter contains collection of nerve cell bodies, which is highlighted in orange, and these nerve cell bodies contain unmyelinated parts of the neuron. Okay, now there is one special thing about the gray matter of the brain. The gray matter in the brain comes in two varieties. Okay, the first variety is the cerebral cortex that you see over here. So everything highlighted in orange is the cerebral cortex. Okay, and the cerebral cortex contains cell bodies of the astrocytes, and they also contain a whole lot of capillaries. And the second one, which is right over here, is located in the brain, scattered around in the brain, and these are called basal nuclei. So these structures over here are the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei or the basal ganglia are scattered around the brain, and they play a very important role in muscle coordination and movement. And they also play a very important role in eye movement and learning tasks like riding a car or playing an instrument or tying the shoe. So they play a role in day-to-day activities. When, in, for example, again, in people with Parkinson, if the ganglia malfunction, this causes jerky movements of the body that you see in people with Parkinson's. So there are a lot of substructures or different types of basal ganglia, but I don't need you to know that much detail. So just understand that there are two varieties of gray matter. One is the cerebral cortex that is located superficially. Then you have these structures which are the basal nuclei that are located deep in the brain. The basal nuclei receive information from the midbrain and the motor area of the cortex, and then they send signals back to both these locations. So they are highly involved in control of motor movement in the body. So see, the white matter is highlighted in panel B. The white matter lies deep to the gray matter. And it is white because it contains a lot of myelinated nerve fibers. So our brain contains a lot of fat, and this myelinated region looks almost pearly white. And these regions contain tracts or bundles of axon that connect one part of the brain to another, or they connect the brain to the spinal cord. So the white matter basically controls the communication between the cerebrum and the lower centers of the central nervous system. We have a lot of tracts, and the tracts are classified by the direction in which they run. Okay. Let me remind you that this is the sagittal section, mid-sagittal section of the brain. So this is the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum. This is the brain stem. This is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the structure that is highlighted in the picture is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is highlighted right over here. And this is a close-up image. So you can see this is the pituitary gland. This is the sella turcica bone, if you remember, the bone marking in the floor of the cranium. So that's the sella turcica, that's the pituitary gland. So this becomes the hypothalamus, and right over here is the thalamus. Now this one over here is the frontal section of the bone, and you see this corpus callosum, what it looks like in the frontal section. And this is the CT scan image where you see the corpus callosum. So just different views of the corpus callosum. Now, what is the corpus callosum? The corpus callosum is a thick bundle at the base of the longitudinal fissure. The corpus callosum connects the left and right hemisphere. Okay, so these are a bundle of nerve fibers that connect both sides of the brain. Long back in the 40s, when they did not know much about brain surgeries, a surgeon named Roger Perry, he developed a surgical procedure known as split brain surgery. And the tongue-tied. The split brain surgery was used to treat patients with severe seizures. Okay, so when the corpus callosum was cut, that was called split brain surgery. So it did improve seizures. However, several years later, a lot of studies showed that seizures improved, but it changed the behavior of the patient. For example, let's just say one patient was trying to be aggressive with one arm, but the other arm was trying to interrupt and prevent the man from being aggressive. And things like, the person could name a picture when they looked at the picture of the grape, but they could not read, the words that were written when it was flashed. Okay, but since they could not read from one side of the brain, the other side of the brain saw the letter and they could draw it out with their eyes closed. Okay, so this is a link to the study on the patients that underwent split brain surgery. Very interesting, so you must watch this. Okay, so that's when they realized that cutting the corpus callosum was actually affecting the behavior and the communication between both sides of the brain. Now, this link is really interesting, so make sure you watch the video in this YouTube link attached. So in a sense, corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers that are important for communication between both sides of the brain. So the next portion, the major region of the brain, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum occupies the posterior cranial fossa towards the base of the skull in the back, and it contains gyri and sulci as well, just like the cerebrum. Okay, now this makes up only about 10% of the brain's volume, but it contains over 50% of the brain's neurons. So you're looking at different views of the cerebellum right here. That's the mid-sagittal view. This one is a closer view of the mid-sagittal section. This is the sella turcica. If you remember, I think I should write that down for you because most probably you might not remember. That's the sella turcica. Okay, sella turcica. Okay, or the Turkish saddle, that's why it's called sella turcica, is located right over here. And this region is the brainstem. These are the pons and the medulla oblongata. This one is the corpus callosum. This is the hypothalamus. And this over here is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located under the cerebrum. So this, what you're looking at, is the inferior view of the brain. This is the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the second largest portion of the brain. It looks like a cauliflower. Now, it only makes up 10% of the mass, but it contains 50% of the brain's neuron. The cerebrum, keep in mind, does not initiate movement, only coordinates movement. So the job of the cerebellum is to process inputs from the cerebral cortex in the cerebrum, and they fine-tune these signals and they regulate skeletal movement. So the cerebellum is only important for, well, not only, it's very important for initiating, sorry, did I say initiate? For coordinating movement. Okay, so the cerebrum, I should write that down because this is a lot of information. So it does not initiate movement, only coordination of the movement. So the signals from the cerebral cortex are studied in the cerebellum, and they are fine-tuned, and then they regulate skeletal movement, balance of the body, eye-hand coordination. They're also important in development of a baby. When the baby learns to walk or play, the cerebellum stores information that is necessary for developmental progress. So earlier they thought that the cerebellum was only responsible for coordinating motor functions, but in recent studies, scientists have showed that the cerebrum and the cerebellum both contain regions for emotional control and some mental processing and cognitive processing. Okay, but if you want to look at just the major functions of the cerebellum, just remember the cerebellum is responsible for coordination of voluntary movement, okay, not involuntary movement. Okay, and the other function is to store memory of a learned motor pattern. Okay, anything voluntary like walking, playing, riding a car, anything that we learn, this is where the information gets stored. Okay, so the next major region of the brain is the brainstem. Now, if you remove the cerebellum and the cerebrum, you'll be left with the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem is the region that connects the upper region of the brain to the spinal cord. So this area is the brainstem. Right over here is the cerebellum. This large portion is the cerebrum. Now, the major components of the brainstem include the diencephalon that form the thalamus and hypothalamus, etc. And then you have the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. The brainstem can be divided into diencephalon, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. A lot of times, diencephalon is considered a part of the brainstem because it is directly connected to the brainstem located inferiorly. That's right over here. The midbrain consists of, well, it connects the forebrain and the hindbrain, so it acts as the bridge between the brainstem and the other higher level structures in the brain. So they transmit signals from one portion to the other. They are closely associated with motor control, vision, hearing, temperature regulation, alertness, and a lot more. The next structure, which is a very important structure, is the brainstem. The pons. The pons contains something called as pneumotaxic centers. Pneumotaxic centers. So the pneumotaxic center is just a bunch of neurons that control breathing rate, in addition, it is also involved in transmission of signal to and from other brain structures. So because it's located right over here, so information has to pass through the pons when it goes to the brain or it comes from the brain. The pons is also involved in hearing, taste, balance, and deep sleep. And the lower half of the brainstem, we have the medulla oblongata. So this structure over here is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is responsible for a lot of autonomic functions, like the heart rate, the blood pressure reflexes, and many things that are autonomous, like vomiting, sneezing, coughing. So all of these are controlled by the medulla oblongata. So let's just say the pH of the body is acidic. Okay, this means, if you remember from fluid and electrolytes, oh, we haven't studied that yet, but if you remember from the first chapter, alkalinity and acidity, if we have too much acids in the body, we need to breathe out carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is responsible for increasing acidity. So when we have too much acids in the bloodstream, these medulla oblongata contain receptors for change in pH. So they contain pH receptors that sense the chemical changes in blood. So if the pH is too low, the medulla oblongata tells us to breathe faster so we can remove excess CO2 to raise the pH. So if you want to look at the most important functions of the brainstem, keep in mind pons contain the pneumotaxic centers that control the breathing rate. If you have to just remember one fraction, that's the one you'll remember. And it also has the medulla oblongata and the brainstem, where we have pH receptors to control a lot of autonomic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, vomiting, and sneezing. One of the most important structures in here are the pH receptors to control the pH. If you remember, we talked about the diencephalon when we were looking at the embryonic development of the nervous system. The diencephalon is the region of the forebrain that divides into thalamus, hypothalamus, and then you have the epithalamus and subthalamus based on the location of these regions. Hypo means below, epi means above. So based on where they're located, they've been named epithalamus, subthalamus, hypothalamus, etc. We are going to focus on the thalamus and the hypothalamus because these are things that you must know moving forward. Now, the diencephalon in general is considered a very important part of the brain because we have extremely sensitive nerves passing through this brain. The diencephalon, as you remember, sits above the brainstem, so it's very close to the cerebral hemispheres. It contains 4 parts, but we're going to focus on thalamus and subthalamus only. Now, the functions of the diencephalon, so we are talking about diencephalon over here. So the functions of the diencephalon include, it contains centers. So this is for diencephalon in general. It contains centers for autonomic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is everything that we have no control over. So these are the processes that are controlled by our brain, but we don't consciously control things like speech, movement, thinking, sight. All these things belong to autonomous nervous system. So these are considered self-regulating systems. Now, the other function of diencephalon include area for thermoregulation, and then we have the area for hunger and thirst, and then we have the centers for vegetative nervous system. So the vegetative, let me write that down. Some books still call it vegetative nervous system, or the new term for it is autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system or the vegetative nervous system, they mean one and the same thing. They are a division of the peripheral nervous system that supply the smooth muscle and glands and the visceral organs of the body. Okay, so these are also controlled involuntarily. We have no control over certain things: heart rate, breathing, constriction of the bronchi, digestion by peristalsis, and contraction of a bladder to release urine. So these are some things we have no control over. Some of these autonomic nervous system routes have a sympathetic effect, which means a stimulating effect, and others have a parasympathetic effect, meaning they have a rest and digest effect or a calming effect. Now let's focus on the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So if you look at the structures over here, so right about here, so this is the brainstem, so that's the pons, and that is the midbrain, this is the pons, and right over here is the diencephalon region. The diencephalon region contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the two major parts that we will go over. So right over here, if you want me to point at it, right over here, that is the hypothalamus. Okay, that's the hypothalamus. So I am going to draw a line around the sella turcica. So this region over here is the sella turcica. You did see this when you were looking at the floor of the skull right by the cribriform foramina, behind the cribriform foramina, right? So that's the sella turcica where the pituitary gland rests, and right above the pituitary gland, this orange region is the hypothalamus, and the region above the hypothalamus, if this is the hypothalamus, I'm going to shift up over here. If this region is the hypothalamus, this orange region behind over here is the thalamus. Okay, so let's look at the thalamus and the hypothalamus one by one. The hypothalamus is a center for emotions, biological clock, and homeostasis in general. So it controls a lot of different endocrine structures directly or indirectly. So it plays a very important role in homeostasis, digestion, and heart rate. So the hypothalamus commands the body on how to survive, and it also determines the mating behavior of a vertebrate. And when you get frightened or startled, the hypothalamus gets activated and we have a fight or flight response. For example, if you see a ghost, you get startled. That is due to the activation of the sympathetic nervous system in the hypothalamus. So we either fight or we take off to save ourselves, right? So once we are at a safe distance from the ghost and we are calm and relaxed, this is because the hypothalamus activates the rest and digest response, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. So keep in mind, the hypothalamus controls emotions, biological clock, homeostasis, digestion, and heart rate, and it also controls the mating behavior and the fight or flight or rest and digest response. Now, above the hypothalamus, the thalamus is located right over here. That's the thalamus. The thalamus is located slightly above and behind the hypothalamus, and it receives sensory information from all the different systems in the body except olfaction. Okay, keep this in mind. So the thalamus received sensory information from all the different systems of the body except the olfactory system for smelling. Okay, the thalamus then relays the information of the sensory systems to the cerebral cortex. So right from here, the information is relayed to the cerebral cortex where the information is processed. The hypothalamus also controls the conscious mind. The conscious mind basically means whether we are asleep or whether we are awake and alert state. When we are asleep, no sensory information is sent to the cerebral cortex, so we are unaware of what things are happening. Okay, that's when we are asleep. So when we are asleep, the cerebral cortex still sends message to the hypothalamus, but the thalamus. But when we are asleep, no information is sent from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is basically the gateway for all messages to the cerebral cortex. Every message should pass through the thalamus, whether we are asleep or awake. Now the function is mainly in sensory information relay to different parts of the brain except olfaction. Then we have the control of the conscious mind. It also controls motor activity, and it controls memory. Okay, and the sensory input, once it's delivered to the thalamus, the messages are sorted out and it is delivered to the appropriate part of the cortex. Sometimes it also makes you feel sensation like pain, but you'll not know where exactly the pain is until the message reaches the cortex. Okay, so if you are observing, a little bit of motor activity is present in almost every part of the brain, a little bit of sensory activity is present in almost every part of the brain, but I want you to just focus on the major functions of each structure that we are talking about, and also understand that none of these structures completely function independently. For example, we will still feel the sensation of pain when the sensation reaches the thalamus, but we will not know where exactly pain is in the body until that message is relayed to the cerebral cortex. Another important function of the thalamus is to control the sleep or awake cycle, which is the conscious mind. So what you're looking at over here, I'm going to pull out the pointer. Yeah, so what you're looking at over here is the olfactory bulb. So this over here is the olfactory nerve. Okay, these are the olfactory nerves, and if you remember, the olfactory bulb is located in the cribriform plate. Now this is the superior view of the base of the skull. So this is the cribriform plate. This little projection is the crista galli, and the olfactory bulb is located right in the cribriform plate. And these little tiny holes that you see are the cribriform foramina through which the olfactory nerve passed through for us to detect smell in the nose. Now the olfactory bulb in the brain brings signal from the olfactory sensory neurons in the nose, and this is where the bulb is located. When your olfactory receptors are stimulated in the nose, they transmit impulses to the brain through the olfactory nerves, and this pathway is directly connected to a region known as the limbic system. Now the limbic system is a group of structures that comprise of the diencephalon and certain regions in the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so we'll look at the limbic system a little later. Now the limbic system is the region that is responsible for a lot of emotions, and that's why your reaction to smell is not neutral. Usually either you like a smell or you dislike a smell. Now smells also have a long-lasting effect or an impression that are linked to your memories. Okay, that's why, say, a smell of wet soil or mown grass, for example, might remind you of a vacation in Florida, or a summer holiday on the farm. Or remind you of smell of a chocolate chip cookie that make you think of somebody. So the olfactory region in the limbic system is strongly linked to emotions as well. Let's quickly revise the major landmarks of the brain. Let's start from the medulla oblongata over here. This is the medulla oblongata. Next you have the pons. Then you have the midbrain. Right above the midbrain, you have the diencephalon region. But in the diencephalon region, right over here, I need the pointer. Okay, so this over here is the diencephalon region, where you have the hypothalamus and you have the thalamus. Right below the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary gland that is directly linked to the thalamus, the hypothalamus. We won't go into those details just yet, but this is the pituitary gland. And what you're looking at is right now the temporal lobe. This over here is the frontal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe, and right this region is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe via the central sulcus. And this lighter colored region is the corpus callosum. That's a thick bundle of nerve fibers that connect the left brain to the right brain. Now this structure over here, right inferior to the occipital lobe, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating a lot of motor movements. Okay. And what else? Now the structure is the optic chiasm. So if you have watched the videos on the anatomy of the sheep brain, the structure known as optic chiasm is an X-shaped structure, which is the crossing of a bunch of optic nerves in the brain. So the optic nerves connect the brain to the eye. So if you damage the optic chiasm, it can lead to loss of vision. Okay, and the optic chiasm is also important because this is a very, very important landmark in the brain. Okay, so anything else? I guess this is it for the major landmarks of the brain. We will next look at the protection of the brain.